The World Wrestling Federation in 1995 was in an all-encompassing state of tumult. Its on-screen product, with a depleted roster and uninteresting feuds, was failing to captivate a steadily dwindling audience. Just as problematic, the locker room was beset by politics, factions, backbiting, and understandably, lowered morale. If those latter themes were left unchecked, they could badly influence the former, as was the case when two wrestlers, one an ascending megastar, the other an incoming veteran, found themselves embroiled in a fairly typical feud in front of the cameras and a much more heated one away from them. It all led to two of the strangest Intercontinental title changes ever, both of them occurring just minutes apart. This is Behind the Match. To say that the heel side of the WWF roster was thin in 1995 would be putting it rather mildly. Every pay-per-view world title match from the October 1995 In Your House to the 1996 King of the Ring, that's 9 events mind you, featured either a babyface against a babyface or a babyface against a heel that had been a babyface sometime in the previous year. That should give you an idea of the imbalance that existed throughout the summer of 1995. Once you got past tag team champions Owen Hart and Yokozuna, the inconsistent but passable Psycho Sid and overpush tournament winner King Mabel, you were left with fading has-beens and never-weres that nobody would ever buy as a top challenger, or you were left with young guys that had potential but were still in the larval stage. But fear not, because help was on the way. 13-year veteran Shane Douglas had a brief, forgettable run in the WWF in 1990 and 1991 as a generic undercard occupant, which was still an upgrade over his time as a skateboarder that doesn't actually ride the skateboard in WCW alongside Mr. People Power himself, John Laurinaitis. Come 1993, Douglas brought his solid wrestling skills and relative youth to ECW, where his true calling as a wrestler began to manifest. Dubbed the Franchise, Douglas ran roughshod over the promotion as its dominant champion for the better part of the next year and a half. He complemented his main event wrestling matches with a growling, blustery promo style laced with enough profanities to make Quentin Tarantino blush. This zero F's given version of Douglas had no problem making enemies, whether he was publicly ridiculing Ric Flair, with whom he had a real-life grudge, or dismissively throwing down the NWA World title like an offensive gag gift. The unapologetic coarseness and devilish confidence in Douglas's voice endeared the Pittsburgh native well to wrestling fans on the opposite end of the state. Soon, the wrestling world at large began warming to what Douglas brought to the table. The long-reigning ECW champion dropped the title to the Sandman in the spring of 1995, shortly before he began fielding overtures from the WWF. Pat Patterson and Jim Ross both reached out to the franchise, and before long, Douglas and his wife were on their way to New York to meet with Vince himself. Douglas recalled years later that McMahon spared no expense in winning his confidence, from leaving he and his wife tickets to a Broadway show to sending champagne to their hotel suite. Though Douglas had suspicions that a jump to the big time might not be the bed of roses that it seemed, he took the deal. And it wasn't long after he'd bought in that he began to experience a little something called buyer's remorse. This was because Douglas was no longer the franchise. In the grand tradition of new generation WWF doling out occupational gimmicks, he was now a broad caricature of a starched shirt schoolteacher named Dean Douglas, complete with nerdy glasses and a droning monotone that betrayed the vicious rasp of his trademark promo style. As the Dean, Douglas would give bad grades to babyface wrestlers for their in-ring performances and make like he was dragging his nails down a chalkboard as an attention-getting device. While Douglas actually did teach economics and US history at one time, teaching as a gimmick didn't play well to his strengths as a performer, as he loathed having to cut promos the way that Vince directed him to. After one particular session of recording debut vignettes, Douglas remembered, "The first thing I did was call Paul Heyman, and I said, 'Paul, get me the F out of here.'" But an unsatisfactory and restricting character wasn't going to be his only problem in the WWF. He also had an enemy in Shawn Michaels. That apparently wasn't always the case, however. During Douglas's first go-round with the WWF in 1990, he recalls being in tight with Michaels, Marty Jannetty, and a young Dustin Rhodes, so much so that the Rockers would stay at his brother's house whenever the Federation rolled into the Pittsburgh area. As an interesting aside, Douglas even teamed with Jannetty at house shows that summer while Michaels was sidelined with a knee injury. At the time Douglas agreed to come back on board in 1995, Michaels was in an extremely plum spot in the WWF. He had won his third Intercontinental title from Jeff Jarrett that July and was already penciled in to capture his first World Championship at the following year's WrestleMania. Michaels' innate charisma and unparalleled working style put him in a very small class. Problem was, there was a dearth of strong villains to line up across from him. It seemed like Douglas was just the antagonist that Michaels needed, even if HBK versus the franchise would have been far more interesting than, say, HBK versus an evil version of Ben Stein's character from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Ultimately, the two were set to square off at the October 1995 In Your House for Michaels' IC title, with Douglas reportedly scheduled to win the belt. But a few funny things happened on the way to Winnipeg. Like the fact that Douglas didn't know how to work, apparently. Douglas's first match back with the company was taped the night after the 1995 SummerSlam, pitting the Dean against the 1-2-3 Kid. And that 5-minute match was apparently enough to sour the Kliq on Douglas. In his 2005 memoirs, Michaels referred back to the post-match scene, saying Kid came to the back and said isn't going to happen. If you can't work with Kid, you can't work, period. The fact is, Douglas was no good. We tried to help him, but he was worthless. Seems like a pretty harsh criticism, especially based on a singular match, and especially given that Douglas never seemed to field such criticism previously. Nonetheless, Douglas continued his push. He defeated Razor Ramon at the September In Your House in a match that he described as pulling teeth. Douglas maintains that Razor sandbagged him, unhappy about having to do the job, whereas Scott Hall in later interviews ran down Douglas for being overrated and not living up to the expectations of him coming into the company. Michaels also defended Hall, saying that neither he nor Kid would ever sandbag an opponent because, well, that's a reflection on them. At the Raw tapings the night after, there was a 6-man tag pitting Michaels, Diesel, and The Undertaker against Owen Hart, Davey Boy Smith, and Yokozuna, as part of a chaotic scene that ended with all three babyfaces being beaten into oblivion, and interloping Douglas brutalized Michaels, helping to set the stage for their title match in October. At the Superstars taping the next day, Douglas worked a dark match with Michaels that ended with the Intercontinental Champion winning via roll-up. During the untelevised bout, Douglas remembers Michaels at the start of the match taking a bump off of a simple lockup before openly laughing at him in front of the assembled crowd. Following what Michaels apparently downplayed as a simple rib, Douglas also claims that his opponent continued to be a nuisance whenever he tried to call spots, leaving Douglas fuming. A week later, Douglas departed with half of the roster for a tour of Europe, while Michaels wrestled on a house show loop that encompassed the northeastern US. But upon returning to the States, Douglas fielded a phone call from Davey Boy Smith, who had wrestled Michaels at the American live events. As Douglas remembers it, Smith said Michaels was talking openly about embarrassing him during their title match at the upcoming In Your House. Douglas had already been through the dark match where he claims Michaels went out of his way to clown him, so if it's true, he was probably expecting more of the same in Winnipeg. His response to the Bulldog was that he was going to stretch Michaels if Shawn even gave him a single reason to do so. But he didn't, because Michaels didn't quite make it to the title match. Days before Douglas and the others flew home from Europe, an intoxicated Michaels was severely beaten in Syracuse. He'd been at a nightclub with Smith and the 1-2-3 Kid following a house show when allegedly Michaels ran afoul of another patron, a 23-year-old soldier, over a woman at the club that the soldier had apparently once dated. Now, there are several differing accounts of the events, but by night's end, a helpless Michaels was being beaten outside of a nightclub and was left with his face mangled. Some stories claim a group of men attacked him, which is the version the WWF wove into their storyline to explain Michaels' condition, while other versions say that Michaels was only attacked by the one lone patron. Either way, he was taken out of the title match for 9 nights later. Whatever his precise condition was come the weekend of the pay-per-view is unclear, but Douglas believes that Michaels was nowhere near as hurt as was portrayed. Instead, Douglas thinks that Michaels got wind of his threat to stretch him should he try to pull something funny on him during the match, and used the Syracuse incident as an excuse to back out of a potentially volatile situation. Douglas went as far as to claim that the marks on Shawn's face at the pay-per-view weren't even because of the fight, they were applied by a makeup artist at the arena that day. Michaels, meanwhile, claims that he did feel fine enough to wrestle, but that Vince made the decision to pull him from the match. Under the impression that he was now a healthy scratch from the pay-per-view, Douglas flew into Winnipeg early in the weekend, where he received some surprising news at the hotel bar. According to Douglas, Razor Ramon waved him over and congratulated him because he was getting the Intercontinental title at the pay-per-view. A confused Douglas was understandably mystified by this revelation because 1. He assumed Shawn wasn't going to be wrestling, 2. Nobody told him about this development, and 3. Why did Razor, who wasn't even involved in the match, know the apparent plan before he did? That all became clear to Douglas following the meeting that he had with Vince the day of the show. There, he learned that Michaels was going to surrender the title to him, but that wasn't all. Douglas claims that after learning about the title handover, Vince then gestured with his hand to a shadowy part of his makeshift office, where Scott Hall was seated in the darkness, listening to the entire meeting between Douglas and McMahon. And assuming that this anecdote is true, this is at least a little bit weird. Douglas then learned that he was losing the belt to Razor immediately after having it awarded to him. When asked what he wanted to do for a finish, Douglas suggested a contestable ending where his leg would break the plane of the ropes during the pinfall, so that he could claim that Razor won unfairly and have a rematch later. The fact that the belt ended that day with a Kliq member and would leave with a Kliq member did not go unnoticed. Bret Hart later wrote, because the IC belt was still a big money spot, the attitude in the dressing room was that it was the Kliq looking out for their own again. Michaels countered this by saying it was the office who decided that Scott would win the title, there was no great conspiracy on our part to keep the belt within the Kliq, and with all due respect to Shane, he wasn't getting over, they'd already given up on him. The plan was carried out that night, as Michaels with a noticeably bloodshot right eye went to hand the belt to President Gorilla Monsoon in an in-ring ceremony, only for Douglas to gleefully snatch it from Shawn's grasp. Michaels then somberly walked off as Douglas quickly fastened the belt around his own waist, possibly figuring that he should enjoy it while he could. Razor hit the ring immediately afterward to begin the unadvertised match. He'd already wrestled once that night, coming out of the losing end of a tag team title match against the Smoking Guns alongside Kid. The early portion of the title bout was nothing but Razor hitting strikes and nonchalantly working the arm, feeling like a slog of a house show match at times, with neither man particularly exerting much effort. And it wasn't until Ramon delivered his trademark fall-away slam 5 minutes in that the crowd came to life. There were moments where the two didn't even appear to be on the same page, including an awkward rollover from an arm drag and Douglas recoiling in odd fashion off of Razor's punches. Douglas was also at a loss for offense. It took more than 8 minutes in an 11-minute match for the new champion to perform any move outside of a punch or an elbow strike, and that move was a back body drop to avoid the Razor's edge. Until then, he was too busy grimacing in one of the many wrist or arm locks that Razor had applied. Douglas finally got some credible offense in late in the match, including a twisting crossbody and a nice looking dropkick before succumbing to an unbelievably random finish. Douglas missing a clothesline and Ramon delivering a garden variety back suplex, then getting the pinfall off of it after referee Tim White, as was apparently the plan, missed that Douglas's leg was under the bottom rope. Also missed is that both of Razor's shoulders were down as well, which begs the question that if this were a legitimate competition, what in the hell was Tim White looking at? The leg under the rope deal was commented on by Vince and company during the post-match replays, where Vince's tone was akin to, oh well, can't grieve forever, before Jim Ross plugged the superstar hotline. Douglas would never receive a televised rematch for the belt, and for the next several weeks he was virtually persona non grata on WWF television, until he appeared on some go-home programming the weekend of Survivor Series the next month. At said Survivor Series, Douglas actually teamed with Ramon as part of an irregular wildcard match that mixed and matched faces and heels as unlikely partners. Douglas was the first man to be eliminated from the bout, getting pinned by Michaels, which was facilitated by Razor double-crossing his own partner. For those who enjoy reading between the lines, this one might require only a quick interpretation. Douglas left the WWF the following month. He returned to ECW at the company's first Philadelphia show of 1996, declaring that the franchise is back. For the next 3+ years, Douglas remained with the company, holding the world title twice more. As a coda to the heat between Douglas and Razor, 3 years later at an ECW event in Kissimmee, Florida, Scott Hall was brought backstage as a guest of Just Incredible, who was unaware of the hornet's nest that he was about to shake up. Hall had quite a few enemies in that locker room, including Chris Candido and Bam Bam Bigelow, with Douglas the most prominent. As soon as Shane got word that Hall was there, he confronted the unwelcome guest, trying to goad him into a fight, while Bigelow claimed that he kept Douglas from actually attacking him. A reportedly dejected Hall left the building shortly after. Since then, all of the beef between Douglas and the various Kliq members has been pretty much confined to shoot interviews. Make no mistake, plenty of words have been uttered about the disdain and low opinions the sides have of each other, but that's just most shoot interviews. Stories of angst, hatred, and bitterness between any two wrestlers are to be expected. But not every story includes backstage scheming from a politically charged faction, possible sandbagging, a change of plans that may or may not have had to do with a street fight unrelated to the issue at hand, and 2 unusual Intercontinental title changes happening 15 minutes apart between the incorporated parties.